Hello, this is Dr. Bob. I wanted to provide you with a brief video lecture about the issue for this week's discussion, if healthcare is a right or a privilege. There's been a lot of debate around this issue for a considerable amount of time. In fact, the President Truman right after World War II, attempted to pass universal health care coverage for all citizens in the United States, but he ran into two major obstacles in attempting to get it done. Number one was the opposition from the American Medical Association. They're absolutely opposed to any type of what they viewed then as a socialized medicine, because the model at the time was a fee-for-service practice, which meant that they received all their income based on charging for people who were sick and needing surgeries, etc. The other major objection was from the Southern Democrats, which is often not well understood in the Democratic Party history. The Southerners, which primarily made up the power brokers of the Democratic Party from the beginning of the Civil War to actually to the mid-1960s, were primarily from the South, and they were segregationists. They absolutely did not want to support the integration of healthcare services, and they were concerned that a universal healthcare policy covering all Americans would force the integration as such. Well, as time would have it, as you know, in the 1965, then the Medicare and Medicaid was eventually passed, and it was equally supported by both Republicans and Democrats, with again the Southern Democrats still not terribly supportive. However, Lyndon Johnson, the president at the time, from Texas, did understand that this is something that needed to be done, and with his support, the act was passed, the law was passed, and now we have Medicare and Medicaid. An interesting note is that Senator Barry Goldwater, who was running for president at the time, did not support the act, and so that is perhaps where one of the first Republican policies against having universal health care began to emerge. It's interesting to note, though, that in today's current Republican Party platform, they do have a statement about health care being a necessary ingredient for a democracy, and it is in their platform that healthcare should be made available to Americans. The issue, of course, is how should it be funded, and to what degree should it become a government-sponsored program? And that's what we're seeing right now in our congressional debates, and consumers from the home front, if you will, who have been impacted by the Affordable Care Act, and now are very concerned that they may lose the benefits that they have. And this has created a very emotional and divisive response to many of our citizens around this issue. And I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. But what I did want to talk about today, as well as, is just to remind you that universal health care has been something available in the European Union for quite a period of time. In fact, their comprehensive care is one of the more prevalent models of health care that is used pretty extensively throughout Europe. Basically, it's paid for by taxpayer contributions, as well as contributions from the individuals themselves. The United States is often touted as having the very best healthcare system in the world. However, when we look at our infant mortality rate and some of the other major indicators, we really are quite far below what one would expect of such a wealthy country. In fact, I was recently in Cuba and was quite interested, of course, in their healthcare system. And if you may or may not know, but they do have a very comprehensive healthcare system in Cuba. And the belief is, even though there may be a lot of poverty for the citizens, they all have access to state-of-the-art, at least in basic terms, primary care and secondary care. In fact, every community is divided into sections, and that section has a doctor or doctors assigned to it, as well as nurses, and people then access their care through that community service, through that community center. The physician also makes house calls at least once a year to do a very comprehensive health assessment. It goes beyond just the health, you know, the listening to the heart and the lungs and, you know, some basic questions, but it looks at all the social determinants of health as well and beginning to address those issues. So even though we may see that under this communist regime, that and a lot of poverty that does exist, and I clearly saw evidence of that, I did not hear one single complaint about their health care. In fact, our average life stay is almost the same as it is in Cuba. In fact, Cuba is higher than ours average length of death. You know, the longevity. There we go, the right word. So the question then becomes, if well, for me, to back up a second, clearly most industrialized countries have health care as a right, as well as even some of our socialistic countries, as I just mentioned, Cuba and some of the others. Now, while many of these developing countries may have theoretically access to health care, such as Mexico and in Thailand and even in Russia, the quality of care varies extensively depending on the country that you're looking at. Particularly in Thailand and Mexico, the care is very comparable to what one might find in the United States, but it is delivered at a very, very significantly lower cost. So the question becomes then, and that leads to the current political debate, is if healthcare is a right, who's going to pay for it and how's it going to be funded? One would be led to believe by one of the political parties that the Obamacare or Affordable Care Act is in the verge of imploding. However, the actual literature and review of that does not support that statement. While there are definitely problems in some markets with premiums escalating across the board, I think it's around 85% of the people in the program are either subsidized or they have some other type of support, and they have not experienced the high escalation in premiums that found in some parts. Now, there are fixes that can be done for this, and it's not the purpose of this video lecture to get into them, but I can just tell you a couple ideas. One is to expand Medicare to age 55. So that we now open up Medicare to a healthier population who will be contributing financial contributing revenue, I should say, to the premiums for Medicare, and making it a little bit more financially viable, because that age group may not have significant health care needs. And of course, it's going to cut down the cost of care because it is a single payer system. Another option that should be considered, in my opinion, is that managed care companies who have done extremely well in the Medicaid insurance pools, in fact, their profits are up over almost 600% since the Affordable Care Act went into place. They clearly have figured out how to make a lot of money off of Medicaid. These insurance companies, in my opinion, should also be required to participate in the Affordable Care Act insurance pool, so that those who are in that gap group can also have access to care. And some of the money that they're making off of the Medicaid process could also be used to subsidize that particular group. There's also significant issues with some of the insurance companies in terms of their protectionism, if you will, of their profit motive, because they're mostly all profit-based, and they don't want to get into a situation where they're forced to take on a higher risk group. But anyway, as we debate this issue, I just want you to think about some variety of issues around this. And the takeaway message is, at least from my perspective, is that healthcare is a right, and we need to figure out from a political perspective, how can we pay for it, and how can we then incorporate a reforming of such so we can put a greater emphasis on health promotion and disease prevention that can help improve the quality of life and then hopefully decrease access or the need to access a lot of expensive care. I mean, the situation about in Detroit and Flint, I believe it was, with drinking water is just one example of the issues that we need to really take on, and because this clearly is a health promotion issue that we need to be responsible for. So as you debate this issue between yourselves this week, I hope this overview is useful to you.